Hi everybody. So we're going to spend some time today looking at the Protestant Reformation and how it took place in England. We're going to spend some time during this video discussing the English Reformation. The English Reformation becomes important later when we're discussing relationships between England and France. England being very Protestant and France being very, very Catholic. They did not get along. It caused a lot of arguments and fights and battles and all sorts of stuff. And we're going to continue talking about this as we go through the class. So it's good to set, the foundation for the religious part because it gives us the context for what goes on later in Europe. So the first thing we need to talk about is the English Reformation itself. And late medieval England had a reputation for maintaining the rights of the king against the Pope. So what that means is that England preferred the rulership of their king over what the Pope was saying. Religious leaders had called for church reform since the 1300s, specifically with humanism in mind. They were starting to get pamphlets and things of that nature from the printing press that was created in Germany. At the same time that the Italians were, the English didn't start the Renaissance like the Italians did. The setting wasn't really good for them monetarily, but they did see a need for church reform. By the 1520s, English clergy, so the English priests, were toying with Protestant ideas. They liked the idea that people should be able to worship on their own without the leadership of the priests and the Pope and the Catholic Church itself. And lastly, England's break from the Catholic Church was not a religious break. It wasn't the work of religious leaders. Only one person could do that. Now, if it's not going to be a religious person's break, then it's going to be a political person's break. King Henry VIII was the king of England at the time that this was all brewing to a head. For political reasons, King Henry VIII wanted to end papal control over the English church. So papal control, he did not want the Pope in his business. He wanted the Pope in Rome doing Roman things, and King Henry VIII wanted to be fully in control of England. Why would a king want to break up with the Catholic Church? Well, this gives him more power in his own country. It almost makes him, and he designs it so that he becomes both the political leader and the religious leader. So, kind of a big deal happening in England. So in order to do this, a lot of things happen, and it starts with him wanting an annulment. At first, King Henry VIII stood firmly against the Protestant revolt. He was a very young man when he became the King of England. He was 17 or 18 years old. When he became king, he saw it advantageous at the time for the Pope to be in his hand. And what I mean is so that the Pope and him were allied. He thought that that was a good thing. So he stood against the Protestant Reformation. But as time goes on, the Pope even awarded him the title of Defender of the Faith for a pamphlet he wrote denouncing Luther. So while the Pope was saying Luther's bad, in that same pamphlet, he called King Henry VIII the defender of the Catholic faith. So, King Henry VIII's ties with the Catholic Church was so strong that that's what happened. In 1527, an issue arose that set Henry at odds with the church. Let's give that some context. And this issue was that he wanted to annul his wife. And annul means basically that the church is okay with the divorce between him and his wife. Now, at the time, divorce was not okay in the Catholic Church's eyes. It's still technically not okay in the Catholic Church's eyes. You have to go through several other steps to get a divorce if you are Catholic, in order to get remarried in a Catholic church. And at this time, he got married to Catherine of Aragon from Spain at a very early age, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. In 1509, Henry VIII had married Catherine of Aragon, who was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain and the aunt of Emperor Charles V. Ferdinand and Isabella, they were the same king and queen that sent Columbus on his voyage. They gave him the money and sent him on his voyage. So they were very powerful. And she was the aunt of the Emperor Charles, the Holy Roman Empire, which had all of Germany and the states around Germany, and was very, very powerful in Europe. So she was his aunt. This was a good political marriage. Most marriages back then were not for love and happiness. Most of the marriages then were for political or monetary gain. So marrying her was good for the English, because she brings an alliance with Spain, and she also brings an alliance with the Holy Roman Empire, which then could help England beat their arch nemesis, France. By 1527, so like 20 years later, the union had produced no male heir to the throne and only one surviving child, a daughter named Mary. So at this point, 20 years later, he's like 30-something, and he's like, yo, where's my male child? Because it was very important for kings to have a male heir. That way they could, pass on their rulership. Henry was concerned about the political consequences of leaving only a female heir. In this period, people believed that it was unnatural for women to rule over men. So Henry even came to believe that his union with Catherine, who had many miscarriages and stillbirths, had been cursed by God, because Catherine had first been the wife of his brother Arthur. So before Henry married Catherine, she had married Arthur, Henry's older brother. Arthur dies, and Catherine is still looked at as a good political move for England. So they want to keep her in the family, so to speak. Henry's father, Henry VII, had betrothed Catherine to Henry after Arthur's untimely death, in order to keep the English alliance with Spain intact. They were officially married in 1509, Henry VIII and Catherine, a few days before Henry VIII received his crown. But because it was illegal to marry the wife of one's brother, the marriage had required a special approval from Pope Julius II. So the Pope had to come in and say, this is okay, this is all right, go ahead and do it. But that didn't help King Henry VIII. He still thought that his marriage to Catherine was cursed, because, all the miscarriages and stillbirths, the fact that she had been his older brother's wife first. He thought that God was coming down and saying, all these bad things are happening to you because you married Catherine. So the king goes and has an affair. By 1527, Henry was thoroughly enamored of this woman named Anne Boleyn. And this was one of Catherine of Aragon's ladies-in-waiting. This means she was basically, following Catherine around, one of her ladies that helped her with her sewing and her reading and getting things done around the house. Anne Boleyn was one of, Catherine's ladies. He was determined to put Catherine aside and take Anne as his wife, because Anne was very beautiful at the time, and Catherine was getting very old, to the point where she was no longer going to be able to have any children. So this he could not do in Catholic England, however, without papal annulment of the marriage to Catherine. So now he's doubly, motivated to annul his marriage to Catherine. The first motivation is that he thinks his marriage to Catherine is cursed. The second motivation is Anne Boleyn cute, and he wants to marry her instead. So when the king's advisors could not obtain a papal annulment, so the Pope was like, dude, I already gave you special dispensation to marry Catherine, and now you're going to say that, no, that's not working for you? The Pope didn't give a special dispensation to divorce Catherine to marry Anne Boleyn. The king's advisors then conceive a plan to declare the king supreme in English spiritual affairs, as he was in English political affairs. So they were going to make him a religious leader in England as well as the political leader in England. So in 1531, in January, Henry publicly is recognized as the head of the church in England as far as the law of Christ allows. So basically they're saying that he's like Christ's right-hand man, and he makes himself this, head of the Church of England. Gives him a lot of power. In January of 1533, so 2 years later, in 2 years, he's able to annul the marriage to Catherine and then marry Anne Boleyn. She's already pregnant at this point, and Thomas Cranmer, who was one of King Henry VIII's advisors, is the one who officiates. He's not a pope. He's not a king. He's not a priest. He's just a guy that King Henry VIII seeks advice from, and he now is able to do the marriage between Anne Boleyn and King Henry VIII. So they also, like a month after he marries Anne Boleyn, in February in 1533, Parliament makes a law that makes the king the highest court of appeal for all English subjects. So what that means is, how here we have the Supreme Court, and that rules everything, and it has 9 people on it, and they all talk and decide and, use the law of the land as their means of, judging people and issues. Well, King Henry VIII was the last person. So it would go all the way up the courts until it got to King Henry VIII. So now he has political power, he has judiciary power, and he has religious power. So this makes him super, super powerful. Super, super, super powerful, actually. He invalidates his first marriage in March. So now he married Anne Boleyn in January. He became the religious leader in February, or the judiciary leader in February. And in March, Cranmer, his advisor, became Archbishop of Canterbury and led a movement to invalidate the king's marriage to Catherine. So now they're not just annulling it, they're saying that it's invalid. It never happened. The reason that they wanted to do this is that King Henry VIII never wants Mary to become queen because he doesn't want, her to turn everybody back to Catholicism. Mary and Catherine, since they were from Spain, were very, very Catholic and very, very against everything King Henry VIII was doing. So then they go as far as to create the Act of Succession and the Act of Supremacy. The Act of Succession in 1534 made Anne Boleyn's children legitimate heirs to the throne instead of Catherine's child, Mary. So King Henry VIII is basically skipping Catherine's child, Mary, and going straight to his next marriage in line. So what this does is later on, when he marries his 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th wife, it makes their children the legitimate heirs first before going backwards to all these other kids. And then he also signs the Act of Supremacy in 1534, and this declares Henry the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. So nobody else except for the king can become the head of the Church of England. All of his opponents are executed. He just goes and kills everybody. And what I mean is when Thomas More and John Fisher and Bishop of Rochester, they refused to sign and recognize the Act of Succession and the Act of Supremacy, Henry has them taken to the Tower of London and then promptly, without a trial, has them executed. And he's making clear his determination to have his way regardless of the cost. I mean, killing friends left and right, no big deal, right? It's not a problem. So yeah, there was a lot of execution going on at the time too. He also goes and dissolves the monasteries. Now, monasteries are where the Catholic monks had practiced their trade. This is also where all the writing and scribery happened before the printing press. They were also predominantly known for their farming, and they, learned a lot. They created a lot of new farming techniques that actually became important later on as the population in Europe grows after the Black Death. In 1538, Parliament dissolves England's monasteries and convents. This means they no longer exist. It's not like they like put acid on them and they dissolved. It's that they no longer are recognized as entities within England. And this isn't just because they're Catholic and he saw them as like some sort of threat. These monasteries and convents sat on land, and this land could be taxed by the English government to support King Henry's very, very, very lavish and expensive taste. So before, and churches even to this day in America even are tax exempt. It means they don't have to pay taxes because they're not like a company or a business. And in England at that time, even back in the 1500s, they were tax exempt, which means they did not have to pay any taxes. They were tax-free land. So King Henry VIII and the Parliament, they saw this as a prime opportunity to dissolve those tax-exempt statuses, kick everybody off the land, and then tax the land. And then this brings us to the 6 wives of Henry VIII. So we're going to talk about these ladies. To satisfy his desires and to secure a male heir, Henry married 6 times. His marriage to Catherine Aragon was annulled in 1533. He immediately marries Anne Boleyn, but in 1536, so only 3 years later, she was executed for alleged treason and adultery, and her daughter Elizabeth was declared illegitimate. So they saw her as having an affair from Henry and for trying to go against his political wishes. So she was put in the Tower of London and then executed at 8 a.m. the following day after that. And her daughter Elizabeth, who ends up becoming Elizabeth I of England, Queen Elizabeth I, she is declared illegitimate because of the Act of Succession. Jane Seymour dies in 1537, shortly after giving birth to the future Edward VI. She gives birth to Edward VI. He becomes the next king after Henry dies, but then he dies, and the Act of Succession is kind of like, what do we do? And because she didn't commit treason and she died of natural causes, her child, and because he's a male, her child ended up becoming the next king. Henry then, after Jane Seymour, who he actually, let me go back for a second, he actually truly loved Jane Seymour. She was his equal, and she put him in his place a little bit. But then she died in childbirth, and he was devastated, like couldn't even look at a woman for 3 years, and they were trying to get him, out of his shell and back to, trying to find more heirs, I guess. Henry wed this woman, Anne of Cleves, from the Holy Roman Empire. She was German, and he never saw her, and evidently she was not very pretty. But they wanted to create that alliance between the Holy Roman Empire and England, and the purpose was to create, by the marriage, an alliance with the Protestant princes of Germany. The marriage was annulled by Parliament, and Cromwell was dismissed and eventually executed for making Henry marry this horrible woman. She wasn't that bad. I don't know. And then Catherine Howard was beheaded for adultery in 1542. And then Henry's last wife, Catherine Parr, she was a patron of humanists and reformers. She survived him. So he died, and she's still alive. The next one to become powerful, so when King Henry died, his son and successor, Edward VI, was only 10 years old. He was a baby. He can't rule the kingdom. So instead of him ruling by himself, they put some of the advisors as regents, which means they're kind of like ruling the country without really being king until Edward was ready to be king. And under the regencies, the regents, of the Duke of Somerset and the Duke of Northumberland, England fully enacted the Protestant Reformation. So they're going fully against being Catholic. Mary I, so this is Catherine of Aragon's daughter. Edward VI died when he was very, very young. he died of sickness. He was never like a very stoic and strong young boy. He was constantly sick on and off throughout his childhood, and it was kind of like, he ain't gonna make it. But Catherine of Aragon's daughter, so now the Act of Supremacy, they start going down all the different wives that Henry's had. The first one being Mary the First, who is Catherine of Aragon's daughter. She succeeds Edward to the English throne as Mary the First, and decided to restore Catholic doctrine and practice. Remember, she's from Spain. Her mom is Spanish, and they are very, very Catholic. So she starts to try and bring Catholicism back to England. The English people, though, the ones who are now Protestant, were like, we don't like that, don't do that. So she was very, very debated. She killed a lot of people for not being Catholic enough. It was, that's why they call her Bloody Mary, because she killed people. Then, after Mary dies, in 1558, the throne was passed on to Elizabeth I, who was Anne Boleyn's daughter. Elizabeth had to determine the future of the Church of England, and Mary had left her with quite a mess. You had Catholics, you had Protestants, they were fighting each other. It was not pretty. So Elizabeth I decides to move cautiously. She moved very slowly, very cautiously, and she then slowly decides to enforce a series of reforms that were later called the Elizabethan Settlement. This settlement were a compromise between the Protestant and the Catholic practices. So she was trying to bring these two groups together by kind of like forging a middle path. Like, look, you can both agree to this. Let's stay in the middle here. The Church of England preserved much of Catholic ceremony and ritual. That's why when you watch, the English weddings, the weddings, they're pretty much similar to a Catholic Mass. They go through all the pomp and circumstance and the ceremony that a Catholic Mass would go through. So the ceremony and ritual is still there. But the Queen reaffirmed that the monarch was the head of the Anglican Church. So very Catholic in nature, but instead of the Pope being the head, the King or Queen was the head. And she used her skills to restore unity to England. She took great personal sacrifice to do that. She never married. She made sure that she was married to England. She never had an heir. She was constantly, debated, but she was a tough cookie. She made England a firmly Protestant nation and had people following her because of the middle path that she formed between the Catholics and the Protestants. So she created peace in her country. Let's talk a little bit more about reform. Also in 1559, an Act of Supremacy passed Parliament, repealing all the anti-Protestant legislation of Mary I. So they took away all the stuff that Mary put in place, and they asserted Elizabeth's right as supreme governor over all affairs. So now she has religious power, and she's reasserting her power as, the supreme governor or the political leader of the country. And then the next reform was an Act of Uniformity. Elizabeth introduced the Act of Uniformity, mandating a revised version of the Second Book of Common Prayer. So, they have this other book. They have the Bible, right? But then they also have a book with all of their prayers in it. And this revised book that took out and replaced some of the stuff that Mary had put in there. It revised some of the stuff that even her father Henry had in there, and made it more of that middle ground for everybody to agree on. She had that revised and put in every English parish. Every English church had this new book. And then lastly, the 39 Articles. In 1563, she issued the 39 Articles of Religion, which made a moderate Protestantism, so not full-on Protestantism and not full-on Catholicism, but this made this the official religion within the Church of England. So the 39 Articles of Religion, they define what the faith is in England, and it's currently known as the Anglican Church, and is still the official religion in England today. So Queen Elizabeth and her family in England right now are the heads of the Anglican Church. They're basically their pope of their church. So very fascinating, goes through a lot of different ins and outs, and it's just how it is in England. And all of this because of Martin Luther and the printing press.